At 0619 hours local time, 4 Ukrainian long-range attack drones crossed into Rostov Oblast, flying toward a converted administrative building on the southern edge of the city that Russian forces had quietly turned into a forward command post coordinating operations along the entire southern front. The building had once housed a regional agricultural ministry office, an unremarkable 3-story structure that drew no particular attention from satellite imagery analysts until patterns of vehicle traffic, security presence, and communications activity around it began to shift roughly 8 months earlier. Ukrainian intelligence had tracked this facility for nearly 2 months once its true purpose became clear, watching convoy patterns, guard rotations, and the arrival of senior staff vehicles bearing license plates and markings associated with specific command elements known to be coordinating frontline operations. Analysts cross-referenced vehicle arrival times against intercepted radio traffic, slowly building a picture of the building's actual rhythm of use, distinguishing between routine staff activity and the rarer, more significant gatherings that suggested senior leadership was present. Tonight was different. Signals intelligence had confirmed a scheduled meeting inside the building involving senior officers, coordinating the next phase of frontline operations. A rare moment when high-value targets would be concentrated in one place at one time, information gathered through a combination of intercepted communications, and, according to later reporting, a source with some level of access to logistics planning for the meeting itself, though the exact nature of that source was never confirmed publicly for obvious reasons. The building itself was not a fortress. Its real protection came from distance, roughly 70 miles from the nearest Ukrainian-held territory, and from a mobile air defense detachment stationed nearby specifically to protect it, along with an electronic warfare unit tasked with jamming any UAV approach long before it got close. Unlike a purpose-built military headquarters, the structure had never been reinforced against a direct strike, since its planners had assumed that distance and secrecy would provide sufficient protection on their own. The 4 drones flew in a staggered line, spaced nearly a mile apart, each holding a different altitude to complicate any single radar lock. Their route had been planned to avoid 2 known Panzer positions, threading through farmland and along a rail corridor that offered natural terrain masking for the first 40 miles. Mission planners had studied satellite weather data for the preceding 2 weeks to select a night with minimal moonlight and low cloud ceiling, conditions that would reduce the effectiveness of any visual spotting by ground observers without significantly increasing the risk of the drones themselves losing navigational accuracy. At 30 miles out, a mobile electronic warfare truck detected unusual signal activity and began broadcasting jamming energy across common UAV control frequencies, exactly the kind of countermeasure Ukraine's engineers had anticipated. The drones, already operating on pre-programmed waypoints rather than live remote control for this phase of the flight, were largely unaffected. Without a constant link to jam, the jamming truck's efforts accomplished almost nothing beyond alerting the wider defensive network that something unusual was moving through the sector. That alert triggered a cascade of secondary responses. A reserve infantry unit stationed nearby was placed on standby, its soldiers roused from sleep and issued additional ammunition in case ground engagement became necessary. A second, smaller electronic warfare team, normally held further back near the city center, began moving forward to reinforce the first, though traffic on the narrow rural roads leading toward the facility meant they would not arrive in position for nearly 20 minutes, time the drones did not intend to give them. The facility's own internal security detail, a rotating group of roughly a dozen soldiers tasked with perimeter defense rather than any serious air defense capability, had spent the previous 2 months growing increasingly complacent, according to later accounts from personnel who served there. The building's designation as a secure command post had never been accompanied by defenses proportional to its actual importance, an oversight rooted partly in bureaucratic reluctance to draw additional attention to the facility by visibly reinforcing it, and partly in a simple, understandable belief that a location this far from the front, disguised behind the unremarkable exterior of a former agricultural ministry building, did not need the same protection as a purpose-built headquarters closer to contested territory. That same night, roughly 90 minutes before the drones crossed into Rostov Oblast, a routine shift change had brought a slightly reduced overnight security detail onto duty, standard practice for the pre-dawn hours when activity around the facility was historically at its lowest. Nobody on duty that morning had any reason to expect this particular shift would be different from the dozens that had preceded it without incident. At 18 miles, a Panzer S-1 crew picked up a faint radar return, one of the 4 drones flying slightly higher than the others to serve as a deliberate decoy. The battery locked on and fired, destroying the decoy drone in a bright flash roughly 12 miles from the target. It had done exactly what it was meant to do, revealing nothing about the other 3 aircraft approaching along separate low-altitude paths, each holding a different heading that would only converge again in the final minutes before impact. With the Panzer crew reporting a successful intercept and believing the threat neutralized, air defense attention around the facility relaxed just enough. The crew commander radioed a preliminary report up the chain indicating the incoming threat had been fully addressed, a report that would later be revised, but that, in the critical minutes that followed, shaped how quickly and seriously subsequent warnings were treated by officers inside the building itself. The remaining 3 drones split further apart at 8 miles, each now approaching from a distinct compass direction, forcing any remaining defensive system to choose which threat to prioritize, rather than concentrating fire on a single formation. One held a northern approach along the rail corridor. A second swung wide to the east, adding nearly 4 extra miles to its flight path in exchange for approaching from a direction the defenders considered least likely given the terrain. The third held a direct southern line, the shortest and most obvious route, deliberately chosen to draw whatever attention remained after the northern Pantsir's premature stand-down report. This 3-way split was not an improvised reaction to the loss of the decoy drone, but a pre-planned contingency, one of several branching flight paths programmed into each airframe before launch, selected automatically based on which of the 4 original drones was lost first and at what point in the approach. Mission planners had modeled more than a dozen such scenarios in the weeks before the strike, running simulations of different intercept combinations to ensure that no single successful Russian engagement, however well executed, could unravel the entire mission. Losing the highest flying decoy early was, in fact, one of the more favorable outcomes among those modeled scenarios, since it meant the remaining 3 drones still had the full 8 miles of separation distance in which to execute their divergent approach paths, rather than being forced into a rushed, compressed split closer to the target. At 3 miles, a second, smaller Panzer detachment stationed closer to the building itself detected 2 of the 3 remaining drones and opened fire. The first missile struck its target directly, destroying the southern drone less than 2 miles from the command post, exactly the outcome its deliberately obvious flight path had been designed to invite. The second missile targeted the northern drone but missed, the drone dropping sharply to just under 100 feet at the exact moment the missile's proximity fuse should have triggered, letting it pass close overhead without detonating. The shockwave from the near miss still violent enough to rattle the airframe and momentarily disrupt its onboard camera feed. That left 2 drones still inbound. The northern one, damaged from the near miss and struggling to hold altitude, its flight controller compensating for a slight but persistent drift to the left caused by shrapnel damage to one control surface, and the eastern one, still undetected entirely, approaching from the opposite side of the building where the defending battery's radar coverage was weakest, a gap in coverage that existed specifically because the terrain to the east included a shallow ridge that the Pantsir's radar operators had long assumed made any approach from that direction operationally impractical. 2 months of pattern tracking had given Ukrainian analysts a fairly precise picture of how this particular meeting typically unfolded. Vehicles carrying senior officers tended to arrive in a loose cluster between Ors 5 and 6 staggered just enough to avoid drawing obvious attention from any casual observer, but close enough together in the historical data that analysts could identify the pattern with reasonable confidence. Junior staff and support personnel typically arrived earlier, setting up the conference room and preparing briefing materials well before senior leadership appeared. This meant that by the time the meeting itself began, the building's occupancy included not just the small number of decision-makers whose presence made the target worthwhile, but a considerably larger number of support staff whose presence was, from a pure targeting perspective, an unavoidable and difficult reality of striking any occupied structure. Inside the building, the scheduled meeting was already underway. Senior officers, along with staff coordinating logistics and communications for the Southern Front, had gathered in a second-floor conference room shortly after 0600 hours, following a routine that had repeated with only minor variation for the past several weeks. Security personnel stationed at the building's entrance had received the earlier Pantsir report, indicating a threat had been successfully intercepted, and following standard procedure for a confirmed intercept, did not escalate the alert level inside the building itself, a decision that would later be scrutinized closely in the aftermath. At 0634 hours, with less than half a mile remaining, the undetected eastern drone began its terminal dive toward the building's main entrance, exactly where staff vehicles were parked and where senior officers were believed to still be inside, based on the vehicle count still present in the lot. Ground guards, alerted moments earlier by the delayed internal warning finally reaching the perimeter, began firing rifles into the sky in the general direction of the incoming sound. But with no radar lock and no clear visual in the pre-dawn light, their fire was scattered and largely ineffective, more reflexive response than a coordinated defense. The drone struck the building's second floor near the main conference area, its warhead detonating inside the structure. The explosion blew out windows along the entire facade and collapsed part of the interior ceiling, sending debris and smoke pouring from the building within seconds. The force of the blast, concentrated within the relatively confined space of the conference room and adjoining corridor, caused significantly more structural damage than an equivalent strike against open ground would have produced, the building's interior walls channeling and amplifying the pressure wave through the second floor. The second damaged northern drone, still holding just enough altitude and battery power despite its earlier near miss, followed less than 10 seconds later, striking the parking area where staff vehicles were clustered together, destroying 2 vehicles and further blocking any rapid evacuation route from the building, the burning wreckage of both vehicles spreading fire toward a third parked nearby before ground crews could intervene. Emergency response inside the facility was slow and chaotic. Fire suppression systems designed for a converted administrative building were never intended to handle a direct explosive strike. And by the time outside emergency crews arrived from the nearest fire station roughly 6 miles away, the fire had already spread through most of the second floor, consuming documents, communications equipment, and much of the temporary infrastructure that had been installed to support the command post's operations. In the immediate aftermath of the blast, the building's remaining structural integrity became its own hazard. Engineers who inspected the site in the following days determined that the second-floor conference room's collapse had placed significant additional stress on load-bearing walls throughout the eastern half of the structure, meaning that rescue personnel attempting to reach survivors trapped beneath debris in the first critical minutes had to weigh the urgency of reaching them against the very real risk of triggering a secondary, more extensive collapse. 2 rescue workers were themselves injured when a section of ceiling gave way roughly 20 minutes into the recovery effort, forcing a temporary halt to operations in that section of the building while a structural assessment was hastily conducted. Survivors from the conference room itself were pulled from the building over the following 40 minutes, some by their own colleagues working with improvised tools before professional rescue equipment arrived, others by the eventual arrival of a proper emergency response team. The exact casualty figures were never released publicly in full, consistent with a broader pattern of limited disclosure regarding losses at facilities of this sensitivity, though regional hospital activity in the hours following the strike suggested a significant number of injuries requiring treatment beyond what local facilities could immediately handle, with several patients transferred to larger hospitals further from the city. The 2 Panzer crews responsible for the sector's air defense and the electronic warfare team that had detected activity but never regained the initiative once the drones switched to autonomous waypoint navigation all faced separate internal reviews in the weeks following the strike. The Northern crew's decision to report a full stand-down after intercepting only 1 of 4 inbound drones came under particularly harsh scrutiny, though defenders of that crew noted, not unreasonably, that no protocol at the time required them to assume additional undetected threats, remained simply because the first target had been engaged successfully. That protocol was rewritten within a month, requiring any intercept report from a multi-contact engagement to explicitly account for every initially detected signal before any stand-down status could be declared, a bureaucratic change that traced its origin directly back to the 3 minutes of relaxed vigilance that followed the first missile's successful hit that morning. The eastern radar gap, the terrain-based blind spot that had allowed the fatal drone to approach entirely undetected, received similar attention. Engineers were dispatched within 2 weeks to survey alternative radar placement options that could account for the shallow ridge's masking effect, though implementing a permanent fix would take considerably longer than the review process itself, leaving the gap effectively unaddressed for months, even after its existence had been definitively proven by the worst possible kind of evidence. In the hours after the strike, communication out of the facility went almost entirely dark, a silence that itself became a significant data point for analysts monitoring the broader effect of the attack. Units along the southern front that had relied on this command post for coordination reported delays in receiving updated orders, confusion over which alternate channel to use, and in at least 2 documented instances, duplicated or contradictory instructions issued from a temporary backup coordination point hastily established at a different location roughly 15 miles away. 1 frontline artillery battalion, awaiting updated targeting coordinates that had been scheduled for transmission through the Rostov facility that same morning, reported receiving no updated guidance for nearly 18 hours, forcing its commanders to rely on outdated positioning data that, according to a later internal assessment, contributed to at least 1 instance of fire being directed at a location Russian forces had already vacated 2 days earlier, wasting scarce artillery shells on an empty position. Smaller disruptions of this kind, individually minor, accumulated across dozens of units simultaneously reliant on the same disrupted coordination structure, producing a cumulative effect on operational tempo across the southern front that outside observers would only partially reconstruct in the weeks that followed through open-source analysis of unusual troop movement patterns and uncharacteristic delays in previously predictable Russian response times to Ukrainian frontline activity. The strategic impact extended well beyond the physical damage to a single building. A functioning command post coordinating operations across an entire front had been forced offline at the exact moment it was most needed, disrupting communication and planning during a critical operational window. Even a temporary disruption to command coordination at this level can cascade into delayed decisions and confused troop movements along the wider front for days afterward, an effect far harder to quantify than a burned-out building, but arguably more consequential to the immediate course of operations in the region. Investigators reviewing the incident afterward identified the same pattern that has repeated across similar strikes throughout the war. a defensive network that performed adequately against the obvious, expected threat and failed against the one variable it had not fully accounted for. The premature stand-down report from the 1st Panzer Intercept, reasonable in isolation, reduced the urgency with which subsequent warnings were treated. The radar gap to the east, dismissed for practical reasons, based on terrain assumptions that had held true for years, existed specifically because nobody had seriously tested whether those assumptions still applied against an adversary who had spent 2 months studying exactly that kind of gap. The building was never rebuilt on the same site. Within 3 weeks, satellite imagery showed construction equipment clearing the damaged structure entirely, and command functions previously concentrated that were deliberately dispersed across at least 3 separate, less centralized locations, a direct acknowledgement that concentrating this much coordination authority in a single, identifiable building had become a liability that outweighed whatever efficiency the arrangement had once provided. 4 drones, one deliberately sacrificed as a decoy, had done what months of frontline pressure alone could not: force a command structure to relocate, rebuild trust in its own communications, and operate under the knowledge that even facilities 70 miles from the front were no longer safe, no matter how carefully their location and purpose had been concealed. What do you think mattered most here? The decoy that drew the first intercept and triggered a premature stand-down report, the split approach from 4 directions that overwhelmed the defending battery's attention, or the 2 months of pattern tracking that identified exactly when senior officers would be concentrated in one place at one time? Let me know in the comments. Goodbye.